tell you a little bit about myself other than just what I've published so far. I have been in special education for 22 years. I started out in residential treatment facilities in Western Mass. And the question I always get from everyone is why I'm interested in asylums. And the answer I give you is that my parents think I belong in one. No, they make that joke. They used to make that joke at every single one of my book events. To reporters, even. So that was fun. The first residential that I worked at had historic ties to Northampton State Hospital, which is the only state hospital in the western part of the state. There is stuff west of 290. Just want you all to know that there is more of the state. I mean, we don't have much out there. It's mostly darkness and chaos, but we did have a state hospital. And while I was working at that residential, a friend of mine said, you know, they're in the process of tearing down Northampton. Why don't we take a look at it before they're done? And we went up and just kind of walked around the fence like the responsible adults that we were. And a couple of teenagers came up to us and said, hey, you going in? And I said, no, of course not. It's posted. It's no trespassing. And one of the kids said, well, that's too bad because we know where the tunnels are. And I just took off. I left the guy that I was with just standing there. I had no idea who these kids were or what they were going to go do in the tunnels. I didn't care. I wanted to see the tunnels. But on a serious note, after following these kids through the tunnels, I came up into probably one of the most beautiful buildings I've ever seen in my life. And I was shocked to see something that beautiful and to know what its purpose had been from the time that it opened in 1896. And I said, well, or 18, oh my goodness. Wow, it's been a long day. So Northampton State, we're not here to talk about that one anyway, so it doesn't matter when it was built. 1856. And I had to know more. So I started doing research, mostly through people who were doing what I was doing, urban exploration, breaking into the buildings and taking pictures. But I had enough friends in that group who were also very intellectual and needed to know the history, that there was a lot out there. There was a lot available, not just the Wikipedia entries and some of the videos on YouTube where you see kids saying, oh, there's a ghost in there or something. I wanted the true history, and that's what got me started on this journey that I never expected, that has run parallel with my special education career. I am getting my doctorate in special education. I was previously a special education administrator in a specialized special ed day school. Say that 10 times fast. And I love what I do, and what I do also informs how I work with my students when it comes to learning about their rights and the history of what came before where we are now. So, that brings me to Danvers. And please pardon my notes, but it's been a number of years since I wrote this book, and I've also written a few in between, and I also run the Belchertown State School Friends Association in Western Mass. So that has been my world for the last few years, has been all state schools. So I have to kind of shift gears to talk about the mental health world again, which I love doing. I love getting the chance to talk about the mental health world again. So, without further ado. So this is from one of the original annual reports of the State Lunatic Hospital at Danvers. That was its original name. On this side of me is Thomas Story Kirkbride. He was the superintendent of the Pennsylvania State Hospital for the insane, and he eventually founded what is today the American Psychological Association. And he was studying people with mental illness and trying to figure out some of the best ways to treat them. And he came to the conclusion that not only did you have to treat them with therapy and medicine, but you had to treat them with where they were living. He created what's called the Kirkbride Plan of hospitals. And we have a number of those here in Massachusetts, and Danvers is one. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is what a Kirkbride hospital looks like from the sky. It looks like a bat with its wings outstretched. So you'll hear it referred to as the Kirkbride Plan, sometimes as the bat wing. I think Kirkbride sounds a little nicer and a little less creepy. But the idea behind this structure was that you could take patients and move them around the building to where they would be most comfortable and dependent on their level of care. So in the middle, in the body of the Batwing, would be the administrative offices. People would come and go from there. The wards closest to the body of the bat were the wards where patients lived who could have jobs. They could have visitors. They could come and go as they pleased. And the further you moved out towards the tip of the bat wing, the more intense the patient became. So that the patients who were aggressive, violent, patients who were loud, were way at the end of the bat wing, so that everyone else was separated from them. And originally, when Danvers first opened, all of those wings were unlocked. There were no locked wards at Danvers. Patients came and went as they pleased, which shocks almost everyone who ever hears that. But Danvers was unlocked. So each one of the wings would house a separate single ward. Most of the rooms were meant to be single rooms. Danvers was a larger capacity, so it didn't stay that way for very long. Northampton, by comparison, the private rooms stuck around for quite a while because the population was a little bit smaller. So one of the wonderful things that came out of the Kirkbride plan was that, excuse me, sorry, got ahead of myself now. Oh yes, Danvers, they paid close attention to the way it was built, and you could see that in details such as none of the corners of the walls were ever a sharp corner. They rounded everything. There were no sharp corners in Danvers because they didn't want patients hurting themselves. They planned it to that degree of care to make sure that the patients were comfortable, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. So Danvers was designed by Nathaniel J. Bradley, who put his own stamp on Danvers. Almost every single one of the hospitals, can you go back one second? You can't really see it that one, so. If you look at the end of the wings, they have these tiny little kind of flippers, and that Danvers is the only hospital that has that. So that was Nathaniel J. Bradley's stamp on this hospital. It was his own architectural stamp. And those had a special ventilation system, which was, they had these beautiful cupolas, and one of the cupolas is actually part of a private home now in Danvers. Mr. John Archer salvaged the cupola and built it into his house, and it's incredible. So if you can skip to the head for me. So this is a beautiful original map of the plot plan where Danvers was, which folks I'm sure know it's now largely condos, apartments, and houses. So the original facade of the hospital still exists, as do the two cemeteries. Everything else has been rebuilt. So the total acreage for Danvers was 198 acres, and that included a working farm. And originally, it was built to relieve overcrowding at the three other existing hospitals, Worcester, Taunton, and Northampton. This is a picture of one of the wards with nurses attending to patients. And you can see the wards were absolutely beautiful. The original intent was to surround patients with as much beauty and comfort as possible. Doctors believed that if you removed a patient from the things that were making him or her ill, you had a better shot at helping them to get better and go back out into society. The purpose was never to house people permanently. The purpose was to bring them in, give them some skills, most likely coping skills, and eventually medication, and get them right back out so they could live their lives. They weren't meant to stay there forever. That was something that came much, much later. One of the amazing things that Danvers had that no other hospital had were these incredible gardens. There were gardens on both sides of the rear. There was a male garden and a female garden. And the gardens, believe it or not, attracted 12,000 visitors per year. And I'm not talking visitors that were family of people that were in the hospital. They came too, but the public would come. They would picnic in the gardens, and they would bring gifts for the patients. They would bring baskets of magazines. They would bring books. They would bring things from their gardens to share with the patients. And that gave the patients a sense of friendship and camaraderie of these people that would come and visit, people who were pretty much strangers, but they came and visited and brought things for the patients. So on this particular side of the garden, there was a sundial made out of flowers, a scroll made out of flowers, and the points of a compass. They were incredible, and no detail spared. It was absolutely gorgeous. So part of the treatment that patients were receiving in the Kirkbride hospitals was called moral treatment. This came from Dr. Pliny Earle and Dr. Kirkbride, who believed that patients needed to be outside. They needed fresh air, they needed sunshine, which is a reality. When you're feeling a certain way, when you're down, when you're depressed, you say, I gotta get outside, I gotta get out into the sun. And that is exactly what they wanted for these patients. So you can see the patients on this side closest to me are actually doing occupational therapy outside at a table. And they had occupational therapy right when the hospital opened. That was something that they have always done in the asylums. And then you can see a women's exercise group behind one of the wards on that side. They got the patients out and moving as much as humanly possible, and they had them working out on the farm. They were picking vegetables, they were picking flowers, they were taking care of the animals, and they got out as much as they possibly could. They also did a lot of vocational work at the hospital. They made gifts for the poor. They had a helping hand cart where the patients would make items and then they could sell them, and then they would collect money in order to do more activities on the grounds of the hospital. So they had these nice little vocational opportunities going as well. Eventually, the wards were split into units that were regionalized. So you'll see at the top of this piece of paper that it says Lynn Unit, Ward B3. This is a patient's requisition form. So there was a patient that was looking for a sweater, some shirts, a blouse, and a pack of cigarettes. And she was charged $10 for that. Now, whether or not the patient paid it, the family paid it, or the state paid it, we don't know. But it was paid. She got what she needed. And Dr. Kadopian, who was the superintendent at the time, signed off on it. They also printed their own newsletter. This would have been put together with help from the patients, obviously editing and things from the folks who were running the program. And then they were printed right there on campus and distributed to everyone, staff, residents, families, everyone. So that is health topics. Now, when we think about Danvers State Hospital today, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Anybody? What's the first thing? Lobotomy. See, I got it on the first try. When we talk about Danvers, we think lobotomy. And the prefrontal lobotomy was perfected at Danvers. Dr. Walter Freeman was studying at Danvers, working to perfect his transorbital lobotomy. Now, unfortunately, we've all seen those in horror movies, when they put the ice pick through the eye. That is accurate. That is an accurate depiction of how they did the surgeries. It was less brutal than what you see in horror movies, but that is how they did it. It was an ice pick through the orbital socket right into the brain. And what that did was it separated some of the nerve endings in the frontal lobe that helped patients to be calmer, be more regulated, and hopefully beat depression, especially deep depression that wasn't responding to any other type of treatment. Now, we still do lobotomies today, but it is a completely different surgery. It is as non-invasive as it can possibly be, and it's only as an absolute last resort. But when Walter Freeman was studying in the 1940s and perfecting his lobotomy, there weren't many other options. Psychopharmaceuticals had not come out yet. There were no drugs to treat severe depression. And when you have an overcrowded hospital with many people who need help and they're not responding to other treatments, lobotomy was the best they could do with the information that they had at the time. However, Walter Freeman was very excited about this procedure, and he took it on the road in his station wagon, which he called the lobotomobile. So, things not to do when you're trying to market your business. And he very famously lobotomized Rosemary Kennedy and unfortunately botched it. She remained nonverbal, incontinent, and unable to care for herself and was institutionalized for the remainder of her life after she had a lobotomy with Dr. Walter Freeman. Which also...
What time was this?
What was that?
Well, what time was this?
This would have been early 1950s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, early to mid 1950s.
Okay.
Alongside lobotomy, there are a number of other treatments that they used at Danvers, and you'll see on this side hydrotherapy. They would control a patient's level of agitation by putting them in a bathtub, and filling either hot water or cold water. These tubs are what are called circulating tubs. So they would keep the water flowing around the patient, and they would pull a canvas cover up over them so that they could just kind of float, and the water would just kind of, it's almost like the hydrotherapy tables that they have today if you go to the gym or to a place that does massage, that they have hydrotherapy tables that just kind of massage you all the way up. That was the theory here, and that by controlling the temperature and massaging the person with the action of the water, that could help to break a mood. If someone was anxious, if someone was severely depressed, they would try this. Another thing that they used was packing people in sheets that were wet, sometimes cold, sometimes hot, because changing the body temperature, they thought would help to change how people were feeling. We all know if you go outside and it's freezing cold, it kind of gives your body a little bit of a shock. And that's what they were looking for. It was to shock some of these feelings out of people. And of course that led us to electroshock. Yes, electroshock therapy, which was practiced at Danvers quite frequently and is still in practice today, but they've changed the methods. The original electroshock therapy machine was very crude and very difficult to control, to the point where the person administering the therapy would get shocked as well. Today it is a much more controlled situation, but what electroshock therapy does is it causes a momentary seizure in the body. And the reason that was considered a good way to treat depression, mostly schizophrenia, was that doctors had seen that no schizophrenic person ever had epilepsy, and no epileptic person ever had schizophrenia. So they figured if we can trigger seizures, maybe we can kick out the schizophrenia and the depression. And in many cases, it does work. They don't fully understand why, but it does work, and it works quite well for many people. And again, it is a treatment that's still used today and is quite effective. They also would induce shock with other things like insulin and a drug called metrazole. We don't generally use that any longer. So here's some pictures of Dr. Walter Friedman performing a lobotomy. And you can see up in the corner, that's a picture of what he called a leukocyte. That's what he called his thing that he was using to swish around in the brain. And what they would do is they would have the patient say their ABCs, and then when they stopped being able to speak, that's when they knew they had severed the correct nerves in the frontal lobe. Very scientific. As you can see on this list of therapies, how many patients received electric shock therapy. This is dated, I think this has a date on it. No, unfortunately this doesn't have a date on it. But if you take a look at the number of patients who had electric shock therapy, 75 male, 80 female, and 30 people received insulin shock therapy. And they've got a check mark next to psychosurgery, but no number. So unfortunately, we don't know how many people had a lobotomy that year. But it's interesting to note the number of people who had electric shock, and to note also that more of them were women. Back then, I say back then, but from the time that Danvers State Hospital opened until probably about the late 1960s, there were more women committed than men because they could be committed by someone else. Men had to be committed by men or by court, by themselves or by court. Women could be committed by the men in their life. If a man wanted to pick up with a mistress when divorce was still illegal, he could commit his wife. If a wife had postpartum depression, she could be committed. If she just simply, if someone said, oh, I think she's a woman of loose morals, she could be committed. Every once in a while on the internet now, there's a little list that goes around that says things you could have been committed for. And even though it's a joke, most of them are real. You could get committed for so many things that today we know are not a problem any longer. We know how to treat postpartum depression. We know how to treat a whole lot more than we did at the time. So one of the biggest changes in mental health care was the invention of psychopharmaceuticals, drugs. And the first drug to come on the market that really swept through the state hospitals and made a big change was Thorazine. They called Thorazine the chemical straitjacket. And that's because Thorazine was such a heavy-duty sedative that they could fit more people on the ward if they were giving them Thorazine because they were just zombies, absolutely. So Thorazine and its partners radicalized mental health care treatment and revolutionized it. There also came this theory in the 1960s that if we can medicate them, then we can also turn them out of the hospital and they can function in the community. However, the side effects from Thorazine, we didn't really know what those side effects were yet. We found out along the way that Thorazine causes what's called tardive dyskinesia. It's movements of the head, face, and body that are uncontrollable. It looks a lot like Parkinson's, and it degenerates and it's permanent damage to the brain. So Thorazine is still in use today, but only in severe cases, thankfully, because it does have a great deal of side effects. I'll tell you, I had a student who was taking Thorazine. It was an as-needed, so when she was in a bad space, she could take the Thorazine, and you could see, even on an 18-year-old girl, you could see the tremors. She would go to reach for something, you could see the tremors. So Thorazine does a lot of damage, but it also does a lot of good for the people that do have to take it as needed. Next slide. And these are just a couple of forms that exist in my collection of Danvers State Hospital things. And one is a request for information. The other, interestingly enough, is an escape report. And I've been told by many folks who lived around Danvers, worked at Danvers, had a family member at Danvers, that when someone escaped, there was a siren, which is the case on nearly every state institution. And they would pretty much lock down the hospital, and they would send out the state troopers looking for the person who had escaped from Danvers. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find one that had been filled out, so all we have is blanks, unfortunately. So this is probably one of my favorite pictures of Danvers. This looks like it's probably early 1940s. And one thing to note in this picture is that the hospital still has its original spire. The top of the central cupola there eventually was taken down because it was starting to rot, and instead of repairing it, they threw it away. They actually took it to the dump and threw it away. When Avalon, the construction company that ended up starting to redo Danvers, took over, they created kind of a similar top to the cupola, but it's definitely not as ornate and beautiful as the original was. But this is one of my favorite photos. This is a beautiful collection that exists in, one of my friends has a whole collection from this woman who was a nurse. Her name was Alberta, and she was at Danvers from the looks of it for quite some time, and really clearly enjoyed her time there. We have a number of snapshots of her from all over the campus. She and her friends posing in different places on the State Hospital campus. And she looks incredibly happy. It was likely her first nursing job. She's very, very young in these pictures. But I'd love to know exactly who she is and who all of her friends are. I'd love to hear what it was actually like working there in the 50s, because that was the heyday of the hospital when it was at its almost near its peak census, and it would have been a very interesting world to be part of. So Danvers State Hospital holds a very clear place in pop culture history. So as early as the 1950s, Danvers State Hospital was being used as a filming location, believe it or not. This is a picture from the set of a movie called Home Before Dark, which was filmed in 1954. It's a wonderful movie in that you actually get to go inside the hospital, see inside the hospital when it was still open and operating, because they literally were just kind of operating around the movie crew. They let the movie crew on campus, they filmed, and life went on as normal around the movie crew. This is another one from Home Before Dark, one of my other favorite photos of the State Hospital. And you can see them with the fans trying to move the snow around, and they were trying to create a snowstorm, which is how the movie opens. Definitely well worth watching. picture closest to me is Gray Gables, the nurse's house. And when you took a job at Danvers State Hospital, part of your salary that was included was room and board. They had a female nurses building and a male nurses house. Gray Gables was for female nurses. Eventually they stopped using Gray Gables and they built larger homes for the nurses to live in. And eventually that practice just fell by the wayside at almost all state institutions. Eventually they needed a space for residents. And then when they were phasing down hospital operations, they used the nurses' housing to help get the patients ready to go out into the world by giving them some experience of living on their own and learning how to function, doing things like writing checks and filling their own prescriptions and things like that. And then this was a document that went out to everyone at the state hospital at the very end when they were closing the state hospital. And the last of the patients were being moved to Tewksbury, which is still an open and operating hospital. And you can see the last line on that side that says final bus departs for Tewksbury. So in the mid-1960s, after his sister's disastrous lobotomy, JFK started the deinstitutionalization movement. On the tail of the civil rights movement, people who were either in the mental health field or they were receiving mental health care or they, for many reasons, just got involved in the cause, there was a movement to close down the state hospitals on the basis that state hospitals were violating human rights by institutionalizing people, sometimes involuntarily, and sometimes for nearly their entire lives. So the plan was that community mental health care was going to be set up to receive patients out of the state hospitals, and that community mental health care would serve as the hub for folks who needed that care. The unfortunate thing is, it sounded great on paper, looked great, but there wasn't enough money to make sure that the homes that people were coming out into were safe. There were fires in the group homes, people choked to death in the group homes, and the services that they were supposed to receive out in the community, there weren't enough of them. So the staff members who transitioned out into the community with their residents did the best they could to take care of their residents. However, I don't know, I haven't looked into this, so I don't know what it looks like in Danvers, but in Northampton, after Northampton State Hospital closed, there were hundreds of arrests logged of patients trying to get back into the hospital because they didn't know how to live out in the community. They hadn't been prepared for, all of a sudden, after having 24-hour care, they had nothing. They had a group home worker that could help them to the best of their ability, bless her. But that was it. And now Northampton has a massive homeless problem. The majority of the homeless in Northampton are former Northampton State Hospital patients. But again, I don't know what that looks like in Danvers, if that's the same issue in Danvers. But most of the hospitals that closed down, there is an increased homeless population around those hospitals. And so a lot of these pamphlets went out from nearly every state institution that was in the process of closing at the same time as Danvers. And theirs was called Stepping Stones. It was given to families and residents to help them prepare for what it was going to be like when they went out into the community. And it would give them places that they could check in, places they could fill their medications, places that they could go for therapy. But again, you're asking folks who have had someone waking them up, reminding them to take their medicine, giving them something to do throughout the day, feeding them 3 times a day, and then getting them into bed and taking their medicine again. You're telling them, now you have to do all that on your own, and you have to figure it out. You have to call one of these phone numbers and see who will take you. You have to call these phone numbers to refill your medication. And a lot of people weren't capable of doing that when they got out into the community. So, while those people were struggling to figure out what their life was going to look like, the state hospital sat abandoned for 2 decades, maybe more. Some of these photos are taken by John Gray, who runs the Danvers State Hospital website. It's absolutely beautiful. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you check it out. He has some beautiful historic images, both inside and out, as well as aerials, pictures of the cemeteries, just some absolutely beautiful photographs. and his books are wonderful also. The picture on this side is of the cupola that was salvaged and is now part of John Archer's house in Beverly. The inside of the cupola, the walls, instead of drywall, they are doors for the patient rooms. And he has the last piece of tin ceiling that they could salvage when the hospital came down. And any other number of artifacts. It's absolutely incredible. It's almost as if he built himself a tiny, tiny Danvers. Which, I don't know if that's everyone's cup of tea, but it's pretty incredible. So this is a picture when they started to do what's called abatement, when they start to take the boards off the windows, they start to clean out the building, and then they start to get the inside in preparation for, in this case, rebuilding, because they did save the facade, and they did keep a lot of the original features. But most times that's the last step before demolition. And you can see here where they pretty much hollowed out the core. And it's pretty incredible to see it like that. And they built into it and around it when they put in the condos, which is, it's very cool inside.
Can one go inside?
You can. Yep, you can go inside. They don't seem to mind. There's also a beautiful memorial that finally got put up, I'd say 2 years ago, that you can go and visit, and you can also visit both cemeteries. They are open to the public. I was talking earlier a little bit about Danvers' place in pop culture history. This is a still from a movie called Session 9. The movie is absolutely terrible. If you like movies, you're not gonna like this one. But it was filmed very shortly after the hospital closed in the early 90s. And they did a beautiful job. You get to see a great deal of the hospital exactly as it was when they abandoned it. They did not build it out. They didn't add anything except for one thing in a patient room. They hung some creepy pictures on the wall, and that was about it. They stayed really true to the building itself. And it's really nice to be able to see it all in one piece like that. I like to watch it with the sound off. And Danvers has also inspired a number of artists. Obviously, those of us who are urban exploration photographers loved that place. But these are done by Michael Ramser, who spent a number of years walking the grounds and creating artwork based on Danvers. Danvers also shows up in popular culture as Arkham Asylum in Batman. Even though Arkham originally comes from H.P. Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft, in creating his fictional Massachusetts town of Arkham, created the Arkham Asylum based on Danvers State Hospital. So when they took Arkham out of H.P. Lovecraft and dropped it in the Batman world, the original Arkham looked a lot like Danvers. It now looks a lot like Buffalo State Hospitals. Or so I'm told by the kids. It's good to work with teenagers sometimes when you don't really know the comic book stuff. You're like, yeah, that's not right. All right. This is a pile of the original cemetery markers. They are probably some of the more ornate cemetery markers I've ever seen in a state hospital cemetery. So they stood about this high, and the tops are octagonal, and they had copper numbers affixed to them. When patients died at the hospital and they weren't claimed by a family member, they were buried under their file number in the cemetery, and the number on the gravestone coincided with their file. However, over the years, those files disappeared largely, and when I'd say 15, 20 years ago, Pat Deegan, who is perhaps one of the best known names in mental health care and peer mental health care recovery, she was walking her dog one day and actually stumbled literally onto the cemetery. And some of the markers are ones that were sunk into the ground as well. Those had all sunk below the grass, and nobody realized, I'm sure someone somewhere knew, but nobody really realized that there was still a cemetery there. And she ended up getting the Department of Mental Health to kind of get on the stick and start identifying those bodies. And the cemetery has been mostly memorialized. There are some records that were missing, but they have tried to identify as many of the graves as possible, both in that cemetery, and there's another cemetery out near what is currently a Department of Youth Services program. And it is probably one of the It's the second best memorialized cemetery I've seen for a state institution. Belchertown is the best. And that's not because I'm biased to Belchertown, but a former patient was responsible for the memorialization at Belchertown, and they were able to identify everyone at Belchertown, which was really nice. They also opened up the Belchertown Cemetery for one more burial in 2018. A friend of mine asked to be buried with his friends from Belchertown State School, and they let him, which was wonderful. So this is what Danvers looks like now, all lit up at night. This is, I took this after visiting a friend who actually lives in one of the condos, and her condo has one of the turrets, so she has a tower in her condo. I'm very jealous, and it's absolutely beautiful. So, my final slide, please don't try to read that. But recently, there was some legislation passed that created a special state commission on state institutions, and that commission is now responsible for gathering and protecting the history of state institutions, state hospitals, state schools, hospital schools, anything where folks were committed for any level of disability. And further, the rest of our cause is to find and locate all of the burial records that we possibly can, because there are still many out there. There are still many unidentified bodies. Grafton State Hospital, for instance, their cemetery is completely not memorialized. Gardner is close, but still needs some work. And there are some other cemeteries that have been almost completely forgotten. We did manage to get this legislation passed. The commission was created, so that work hopefully will be starting with any luck this summer. But also, and if you're interested, please let me know. There is another piece of legislation that we will be putting forward rather soon that will make it easier for people to access the records. Meaning, right now, if you were a resident of a state facility and you wanted your medical records, any one of us could go to our doctor, sign a release, get our full medical record, and walk away with it. People who were committed to a state institution cannot do that. They have to get a court order, they have to get an attorney, and they have to jump through hoops. And even then, sometimes they will receive nothing more than a redacted file. It looks like an FBI file that they've given them. And it's their own personal information that they are not allowed to see. So we are working to change that and make it easier for people to access those records, and to make disability history a part of mainstream history. Right now, the history of disability is held by a few, those of us who do the things that I do. And there aren't enough of us to cover the whole United States. We're trying, but it's tough. So we are trying to make it so that disability history is better known, it's more on the forefront, and people have access to it. So if you're ever interested in fighting that fight, please let me know. And that is it. That was my last slide.